I'm 74 years old. Saying it out loud still sounds weird, like I'm talking about someone else. For a long time, age was just a number that moved forward without anything really changing inside me. Today, it weighs differently. Not because of the fatigue of the body, but because of the accumulation of things that are only now beginning to make sense. It is at this age that we realize that we have not only lived what happened, but also everything that we never had the courage to live. For almost my entire life, I believed what I was told. I believed it because it seemed easier to believe. They said that it was normal, that it was just like that certain things are not chosen. They are only accepted. They said that this was love, care, protection, and I never questioned it. Not because I agreed, but because I learned early on that questioning brings silent consequences, those that do not leave visible marks, but shape us from within. I grew up in a simple family, where no one talked much about feelings. My father was a strict man, of few words and many expectations. My mother was always tired, always busy keeping everything running, as if the world depended on it. There were no constant screams, no dramatic scenes. There was something more subtle, a quiet control, a clear idea of what each thing should be, and who I should become. Since I was little, I understood that my wishes were not a priority. I don't remember anyone asking me what I really wanted. The decisions came ready-made, packaged as if they were favors. It's for your good, they said. You'll understand when you grow up. And I grew up believing that disagreeing was a sign of ingratitude, that wanting something different was selfish. Thus, I learned to swallow thoughts even before formulating them. In my youth, when the first crossroads of life appeared, I did not see them as choices. I saw them as paths already traced, in which it was enough to move forward. Work, responsibilities, expectations of others, everything seemed decided before I could give my opinion. When something inside me tried to react, an older voice soon appeared, reminding me to be quiet, that it was not time to make up problems. Over the years, this silence has become a habit, and the habit became identity. I got married, had children, fulfilled roles with dedication. On the outside, my life seemed correct, even admirable. People said I was responsible, reliable, someone who never disappointed. And maybe it was true. The problem is that, in order not to disappoint others, I had to disappoint myself every day, without realizing it. Guilt accompanied me like a constant shadow. Guilt for wanting something different. Guilt for feeling empty even though I had everything. Guilt for not knowing how to explain this discomfort that never went away. I didn't call it sadness. I called it tiredness. A phase. A thing of life. After all, no one around me seemed to question it. So I didn't question it either. Remaining quiet seemed safer. Over time, my body began to speak what I never said. A weight on my chest, sleepless nights, a constant feeling of living on automatic. Nothing serious enough to worry anyone, but enough to accompany me every day. I kept going because that's what I've always done. Moving forward, even without knowing where I was going. Only much later, as an old man, did something begin to change. It was not a big event. It was a simple sentence, said almost unintentionally, that ran through everything I had built inside me. For the first time, someone suggested that maybe I had had choices. That destabilized me in a way that I can't explain, because if it was true, then a lot needed to be reviewed. I began to look at the past with different eyes. Situations that once seemed normal began to reveal a pattern. He was not careful. It was control. It was not destiny. It was an imposition. And above all, it wasn't my weakness. It was conditioning. That realization hurt. It hurt a lot. But along with the pain came something new. A silent relief, as if an old guilt was finally beginning to unravel. Today, sitting in the silence of my home, I understand that obeying was also a choice. But it was a choice made without awareness, without an alternative presented, without room to question. I don't write this to accuse anyone. I write because I need, for the first time, to acknowledge my own history honestly. Maybe it's too late, but it is still time to say I could also choose. The fact that you chose to stay here and hear this story says a lot about you. What I'm going to share next isn't just about my life. It's about silences, choices, and truths that many carry without ever saying it out loud. If you believe that these stories need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel because they are not just mine. They are all of us. When I think about my childhood, I don't remember great tragedies. I remember normality. And perhaps this is the most dangerous thing. Everything seemed to work as it should work. There was food on the table, clean clothes, set times. The problem is that, from an early age, I learned that existing within that order meant occupying little space, making little noise, and above all, not contradicting. I was born in a small town, where families looked a lot like each other. The simple houses, the predictable routines, the repeated conversations. My father was seen as a correct, hardworking man, someone who kept everything under control. Inside the house, this control was silent, firm, constant. He did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. The look was enough. My mother lived to keep the peace. He did not question, he did not confront, he did not create conflicts. I learned by observing that disagreeing only made everything heavier. Then she would shut up, and I learned from her. Not by words, but by the daily example of those who believe that enduring is a form of love. As a child, I even tried to say what I felt. Little things, a discomfort, a different will, a fear, but I soon realized that it caused discomfort. The answers came quickly, almost automatically. That's nothing. Stop exaggerating. You have to learn to accept it. Over time, I stopped trying. The first time I understood that my opinion didn't matter was also the first time I felt ashamed of myself. Shame for thinking differently. Shame for wanting something that was not in the plans of others. That day, I learned that being quiet prevented problems, and this lesson was engraved too deeply. At school, I was the well-behaved student. He didn't give trouble. He didn't question. He didn't get involved in trouble. The teachers praised me. My parents were proud. No one saw what it cost. No one saw that. With each compliment for obedience, I learned to disappear a little more, to mold myself, to fit. Inside me, there were questions that were never asked out loud. Who did I want to be? What did I really like? Where did I want to go? These questions were kept in a quiet place, like forbidden things. I didn't even know how to answer them. I was never taught that I could. When I reached adolescence, the fear of making mistakes was already greater than any curiosity. I watched others making choices, making mistakes, trying again. I just followed the safest path, the one that generated the least conflict. It was not courage, it was emotional survival. And I confused that with maturity. Whenever something inside me rebelled, an older voice appeared, reminding me of all that I owed. He owed obedience, gratitude, loyalty. It should not cause any problems. It must be who they expected. And so, little by little, I learned that my wishes were not reliable, that it was better to ignore them. Silence became my main language. I knew how to listen, agree, nod my head. He knew how to smile when they expected a smile. He knew how to swallow frustrations without anyone noticing. On the outside, I was easy to deal with. Inside, I felt trapped in a role I never chose to play. At that time, I didn't call it control. He called it education, of respect, to do what was right. Everyone seemed to live like that, so I thought the problem was with me. Maybe I was too sensitive. Perhaps overthinking was a defect, so I tried not to think. Today, looking back, I understand that that child was not weak. It was just someone trying to adapt to a world that left no room for questions. And this adaptation, which seemed harmless, became the basis of everything that came after. My youth, my decisions, my silences began there. I didn't know it at the time, but that learning would shape my entire life. Learning to be quiet was the first great lesson I received, and it was also the hardest to unlearn. Because when silence becomes protection, speaking out feels like danger, and it took me decades to realize that. The first big decision of my life came disguised as an obligation. I was still young when I realized that the future was already being organized without anyone consulting me. There was not a meeting, nor an open question. There were only statements said naturally, as if they were absolute truths, impossible to dispute. I remember the day clearly. We were sitting at the table, the same silence as always occupying the space between us. My father talked about work, about stability, about what made sense. He didn't ask if I agreed. He spoke as if communicating something already resolved, and I listened, with that familiar feeling that my opinion would be irrelevant. Inside me, something moved, a restlessness, a discomfort that is difficult to explain. I had other desires, still confusing, but real. There were paths that attracted me, ideas that made me feel alive. For the first time, I thought about saying something, in interrupt, in questioning, but the weight of the environment overcame me before any words reached my mouth. When I tried to show hesitation, the answer came quickly, almost automatically. That's not your choice. The phrase fell as a warning. It was not said with anger, nor with cruelty. It was said with certainty. And this certainty made me understand that insisting would be useless, perhaps even emotionally dangerous. Other phrases followed as if to protect me from myself. You'll thank you later. We know what's best. Don't make it difficult. Every word seemed reasonable, even careful. But together they formed an invisible barrier, impossible to cross without guilt. At that moment, I felt something I had never felt so strongly, The feeling of being small, not small in age, but in importance, as if my desires were immature, irrelevant, a whim that needed to be corrected. I lowered my head. I agreed. And there, something inside me fell silent for good. There was no shouting, no argument. There was silence. A heavy, definitive silence. I understood that insisting would only prolong the discomfort, so I did what I always did. I accepted. I convinced myself that it was the right thing, that maybe I was really wrong to want something different. Over the next few days, I repeated that decision like a mantra. I told myself that I was a passenger, that later I would find my place, that everyone made sacrifices, that this was what maturing was. But deep down, I knew something had been ripped from me before it bloomed. From then on, the next choices became easier, not because I had learned to decide, but because I no longer tried. If that important decision didn't belong to me, why would the others belong? I went with the flow with even less resistance, like someone who has already given up swimming against the current. Over time, that episode became just a distant memory, kept in some corner of the memory. I didn't talk about him. I didn't think much about him. But he was there, influencing everything. Each time I felt like changing direction, that voice returned, reminding me that it wasn't worth trying. I started to normalize it. I said to myself that life is just like that not everyone can choose, that some are born to follow. This idea helped me to continue, but it also imprisoned me, because if I accepted this as true, I wouldn't have to face the pain of admitting that I was prevented from choosing. Today, looking back, I clearly see the weight of that moment. It was not just a decision made by others. It was the beginning of a pattern. The moment I learned that my role was to agree, not to desire, execute, not dream. And this lesson would follow me for decades. At the time, I didn't realize it. I just kept going as I was taught. But that decision that was never mine became the foundation of everything that came after. And only now, so many years later, am I beginning to understand how much it has shaped who I have become and who I have ceased to be. After that decision, life went on as if it were on autopilot. One step pulled the other, always in the direction that seemed most acceptable to everyone around. I didn't feel enthusiasm, but I also didn't feel allowed to stop. I just kept going, believing that someday it would all make sense. Work took up a large part of my days. It wasn't something I loved, but it was stable, respectable, safe. People said I was lucky. I agreed because I didn't know how to disagree. He fulfilled schedules, responsibilities, expectations. I did everything correctly, as I was taught from an early age. The wedding came as another natural step. I don't remember asking myself if that was what I really wanted at that moment. It seemed simply the next step. I married someone good, correct, just like me. We build a functional life, without major conflicts, but also without major deep conversations. The children came, and with them an even greater responsibility not to fail. I made an effort to be present, to offer what I didn't have. I worked harder, I covered myself more, I silenced myself even more. He felt that being a good father meant never showing doubt or weakness. On the outside, everything seemed in place. Organized house, family formed, predictable routine. Inside, something didn't fit. There was a constant feeling of playing a role, of living a life that seemed too right to be true. I didn't know how to explain it even to myself. Guilt began to creep into everything. Guilt for feeling dissatisfied for no apparent reason. Guilt for longing for silence when you should be grateful. Guilt for not feeling the fullness that everyone said was normal. I wondered if there was something wrong with me. I never talked about it with anyone. He didn't want to appear ungrateful, weak, or confused. I swallowed everything, as I always did. I told myself that it was just a phase, that the fatigue would pass, that everyone felt this way at some point in their lives. Over the years, the body began to show signs. A tiredness that did not improve with rest. A low, constant sadness, difficult to explain. Nothing serious enough to alarm, but persistent enough to never go away. I called this the normal wear and tear of adult life. The people around me continued to see me as someone strong, reliable, someone who could handle everything. And I kept that image because it was what was expected of me. The more they praised me for it, the more I felt like I was stuck with that version of myself. Sometimes, in rare moments of silence, I wondered what it would have been like if I had chosen differently back then. But he soon pushed that thought away. It seemed useless, even dangerous. Thinking about what wasn't only brought discomfort. So I went back to the routine. I taught my children to be responsible, to respect rules, to make an effort. I did it sincerely, believing it was right. Only today do I realize that I also taught, unintentionally, the same thing I learned, that one's own will always comes later. The years passed too quickly. When I realized it, I was no longer young, And that old feeling, which I thought would one day disappear, was still there. Silent, persistent, as if a part of me had been left behind, waiting for something that never came. I didn't know it yet, but all that accumulation of silence was slowly bringing me to a breaking point. Not a visible collapse, but an inner awakening. Something that could only happen when the noise of the world subsided. And that was closer than I imagined. The change did not come suddenly. It was not a shock, nor a visible collapse. It came slowly, almost without warning, like a silent crack that starts small and spreads. I was already retired when I realized that the noise of the world had subsided enough for me to finally hear myself. The days became too long. Without work to fill the time, silence gained space. At first, I tried to occupy it with tasks, made-up appointments, anything that would keep me moving. But the silence insisted, and with it came thoughts that I had spent my whole life avoiding. It was in a simple, almost casual conversation that everything began to change. Someone commented on choices, on different paths that could have been followed. Nothing deep, nothing dramatic. Still, that phrase echoed in me in a strange way, as if I had found an old, forgotten place. For the first time, I considered the possibility that not everything had been inevitable, that maybe I would have had options. The idea scared me more than it comforted me, because if it was true, it meant that I needed to revise the whole story I told myself in order to survive. I spent nights awake, reliving old scenes. Conversations that once seemed normal now sounded different. Phrases spoken with authority, decisions made without consultation, silences imposed as if they were protection. All of this began to take on another meaning, and this realization hurt. I felt angry, but I didn't know who. I felt sad, but I couldn't explain it. What surprised me the most was the guilt. Guilt for not having reacted. Guilt for having accepted. Guilt for taking so long to see. I wondered if it was fair to feel all that so late. There was a specific moment when the penny dropped for good. I was alone, sitting in the living room, looking at old photos. I saw a young man who was too serious, always restrained, always correct. For the first time, I felt compassion for this young man. He was not weak, he was in prison. This realization brought a cry that I didn't expect. It wasn't a loud cry, nor dramatic. It was silent, deep, as if something was finally being released. I cried for what I lived, but also for what I never lived, for the choices that were never made. Along with the pain came something unexpected. Relief. A strange, almost uncomfortable relief. For the first time, guilt began to fade. I began to understand that many things were not my failures, but consequences of a distorted learning, repeated for generations. This awakening did not bring me immediate answers. It brought questions. Many. Who would I have been if I had chosen? What can I still choose now? These questions scared me, but they also kept me awake, attentive, present in a new way. I didn't tell anyone that. Not yet. It seemed like something too delicate, too fragile, like a small flame that could go out with any contrary wind. I preferred to keep everything inside me, observing, feeling, trying to understand. That day, something really broke inside. Not in a destructive way, but in a liberating way. He broke the certainty that everything had been exactly as it should be. And in place of this certainty, something new was born. The possibility that there was still time. I didn't know what I would do with this discovery. I just knew that I couldn't pretend that nothing had happened anymore. The silence that once protected me now suffocated me. And for the first time, I felt like talking, even without knowing how yet. This part that comes now is the most difficult to divide. Talking about it means letting go of the silence that has protected me for a lifetime and accepting the weight of being seen as I really am. If you have come this far with me, it is because you understand that some truths are too expensive to remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that stories like this continue to exist, even when it's easier to keep quiet. After that silent awakening, nothing was exactly the same again. I kept waking up at the same times, living in the same house, following the same little routines. But something inside me had shifted. It was as if I was present for the first time, observing life itself with less tired eyes. I spent time trying to ignore this new awareness. I thought that if I didn't feed those thoughts, they would disappear. But they have not disappeared. On the contrary, they began to accompany me in everything, in every small decision, in every invitation accepted out of habit, in every silence I kept unnecessarily. I realized how much I was explaining myself all the time. He explained why he didn't want to go out, why he preferred to stay at home, why he did or didn't do something. There was always a ready justification, as if I needed permission to exist. This realization bothered me more than I expected. It was then that I decided to try something simple, very simple. In a common situation where I would normally agree without thinking, I said no, without raising your voice, without going into details. He just said he didn't want to. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, almost offensive to those who were used to my agreement. At that moment, I felt the old fear return, the fear of disappointing, of seeming ungrateful, of being seen as difficult. My body reacted before the mind, with tension and guilt. But at the same time, I felt something different, a timid but real firmness. I wasn't being unfair, I was being honest. Some people were surprised. Others tried to convince me. There were those who laughed, thinking it was a joke, and there were those who were really bothered. These reactions taught me more than any discussion could ever teach. They showed how comfortable my obedience has always been for others. There was no big confrontation, no emotional outburst. There were only small repeated attitudes, discreet but conscious choices. Each time I failed to justify myself, something strengthened within me, like a muscle that had never been used. There were also losses. Some relationships became more distant. Certain conversations never happened in the same way again. At first, it hurt. I wondered if I was being selfish, if I was exaggerating, if it wasn't better to go back to the old role. But the thought of returning began to seem unbearable. I learned that acceptance doesn't always come from the outside. Often it starts when we stop apologizing for being who we are. This learning was not pretty, nor light. It was slow, uncomfortable, full of relapses, but it was true. At times, I felt like confronting the past, saying everything I never said, but I understood that I didn't need to, not to move forward. Some people wouldn't change even if they heard it, and I no longer needed their validation to continue. The biggest confrontation was internal. It was accepting that my life was not as it could have been, and that it hurt. But it was also accepting that I was still alive, that there were still possible choices, even small ones, even late. And that changed everything. Today, when I do something of my own volition, I feel a good strangeness, as if he were breaking an invisible rule. I don't feel euphoria, I feel peace. A quiet but firm peace that I had never experienced before. Stopping justifying myself was the first step. Small on the outside, huge on the inside. It was there that I understood that I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. It was enough, finally, to start living in a way that made sense to me. When I started to act differently, I didn't have to announce anything. People realized it on their own. They noticed in the way I responded, in the time it took me before accepting something, in the simple refusals that never existed before. It was not rebellion, it was presence. And that, I discovered, bothers me more than any confrontation. Some reacted with disguised concern. They said I looked different, asked if everything was okay. Others wore a light, almost playful tone as if that change were temporary, an eccentricity of age. I listened to everything in silence, watching how my autonomy was treated as something strange. In the family, the strangeness was greater. They were used to my predictable way, to my constant availability. When I started to choose for myself, there were confused looks, crossed comments, small attempts to bring me back to the old place. Not out of malice, but out of habit. At times, I felt like retreating, to make things easier, to avoid collective discomfort. The old guilt still appeared, reminding me that I had always been the stable link, which did not create problems. But for the first time, I was able to stand firm even though I felt this weight. I realized how convenient my obedience had been, not just for my parents in the past, but for everyone around me throughout my life. I solved, I accepted, I gave in. When I stopped doing that, the balance shifted. And changes are almost never welcome. Some conversations grew colder. Certain visits have become rarer. There were those who interpreted my new silence as detachment, when, in fact, it was just honesty. I no longer filled spaces with automatic agreement, and that left visible voids. At the same time, something curious happened. Some people started to look at me in a different way, more carefully perhaps, as if they were meeting someone new, even after so many years. These reactions showed me that not every withdrawal is a loss. Sometimes it's just readjustment. I came to understand that change does not guarantee approval, and that this does not have to be a problem. For decades, I lived trying to keep everything stable, even at the expense of myself. Now, he accepted that some discomfort was part of the process. Growing up, even late, also hurts. There were difficult days when I felt alone, questioning if I had done the right thing. At such times, the temptation to turn back was great, but I only had to remember how I felt before, that constant emptiness, to know that there was no turning back. I wasn't trying to rewrite my story. I was just allowing myself to live what was left of her with more truth. This did not erase the past, but changed the present. And this difference, as small as it seemed, was everything to me. I learned that those who benefit from our silence rarely like it when we start talking, and that this says more about the situation than about us. This understanding brought me a new serenity, less dependent on the opinion of others. Today, when I notice the discomfort in others, I try not to take it as an accusation. Each one reacts as they can. I also reacted like this to changes in the past. The difference is that now I choose not to go back to the place where I was hurt just to maintain the outside peace. Change didn't turn me into someone brave all of a sudden, but it turned me into someone whole. And for the first time, this seemed more important to me than being easy, than being accepted, than being the same as always. I discovered that choosing is not something natural when we spend our whole lives obeying. It does not come lightly, nor with immediate enthusiasm. It comes with doubt, with fear, with a strange feeling of doing something wrong. Each small decision seemed to require more effort than it should. At first, my choices were too simple to attract attention. Schedules, programs, small commitments. Even so, I felt their weight, as if each decision needed to be validated by someone invisible, someone who has always been there inside me, observing and judging. Sometimes I found myself wanting to ask the opinion of others before deciding anything, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. It was hard to trust my own judgment. After all, I spent decades learning that it was unreliable, that it needed to be corrected. Over time, I realized that this insecurity didn't mean I was wrong. It just meant that I was learning something you should have learned much earlier, but it's never too late to start. This idea, in itself, was already a challenge. There were days when I missed the old life. Not because she was better, but because she was known. The known, even when it hurts, gives a false sense of security. The new, no matter how small, always scares. And I needed to deal with it without running away. I began to observe my reactions more closely. When I felt guilty, I tried to understand where it came from. When I felt afraid, I wondered if it was real or just ancient. This exercise was tiring, but it also made me more conscious. The past has not disappeared. It was still there, present in the memories, in the automatic reflexes, in the phrases that popped into my head without warning. The difference is that now I could recognize them, and sometimes even questioning them before obeying. I learned that choosing also involves making mistakes, and making mistakes for me has always been something forbidden. For the first time, I had to accept that I wouldn't always get it right, and that it wouldn't make me a failure, only human. This acceptance was one of the most difficult steps. Some choices didn't bring the relief I expected. Not all of them were good. Not all of them made sense later. But even so, there was something different about them. They were mine, and that changed everything. The weight of error was less than the weight of never trying. Gradually, I began to feel something new. It was not constant happiness, nor enthusiasm. It was a discreet tranquility, as if I was finally aligned with myself, a sense of coherence that I had never experienced before. I started to respect my limits more, to recognize when I was tired, when I needed silence, when I wanted company. Simple things, but that were previously ignored in the name of pleasing or fulfilling expectations that no longer made sense. This process didn't turn me into someone else. It just revealed who I've always been, but never had the space to be. And this discovery, although late, brought me a kind of dignity that I didn't know I was lacking. Learning to choose takes work. Tired. It scares. But with every little conscious decision, I felt like I was reclaiming something that was taken away from me too soon. Not the past, but the right to live the present with more truth. When I started choosing, time changed texture. Before, the days passed as a predictable, almost indistinct sequence. Now each morning seemed to carry a different weight, not of obligation, but of conscience. For the first time, I felt that time wasn't just taking me, I was also walking inside it. I started to realize how much I lived on automatic, how many conversations I went through without being present, how many days I ended without remembering how they began. This realization did not come to blame me, but to wake me up. Being alive, I discovered late, is not just about continuing to breathe. Loneliness has taken on another meaning. Before, I avoided it at all costs, filling spaces with commitments and favors. Now I learn to live with it, not as a punishment, but as a space for listening. It was in solitude that I was finally able to listen to my own thoughts without haste. It wasn't always comfortable. There were long, too quiet days when the absence of noise seemed to amplify everything I'd tried to ignore for decades. But even in those days, there was something different. I wasn't running away, I was staying. I began to wonder who I was beyond the roles I played. In addition to the dedicated worker, the responsible father, the correct man, these questions had no ready answers. And that's okay. For the first time, I accepted not knowing. The mirror began to return a more attentive face. The marks of time were all there, but they didn't scare me like they used to. Aging no longer seems like just a loss. It also came to look like revelation, as if each year removes a layer of silence. The past was still present, but it no longer commanded everything. He appeared in sudden memories, in old habits that insisted on returning. The difference is that now I could recognize when I was repeating something that no longer served me. I started to respect my own rhythm. He no longer needed to keep up with the pace of others, nor to prove that he could still handle everything. I discovered that slowing down is not giving up. Sometimes it's just choosing to continue in another way. There were people who moved further away. Others approached unexpectedly. I learned not to interpret this as judgment. Relationships are also reorganized when we change. Not all of them survive. And that hurts, but it doesn't destroy. I started doing small things just because they gave me pleasure. Walking aimlessly, listening to old songs, staying silent, looking out the window. Simple attitudes. Almost invisible. But that gave me back the feeling of living inside, not just fulfilling time. The future, once seen as something too short to change, began to seem like a possible space. Not big, not grand, only possible. And this possibility was enough to keep me attentive, curious, present. I no longer think of the time I lost as something that needs to be compensated. He existed, and he left marks. What I do now is different. I value the time that is left, not as a countdown, but as a territory that I can finally inhabit. The time that remained gained another weight, not the weight of urgency, but that of intention. Each day has come to matter not for what I produce, but for how much I am whole in it. And this change, although silent, transformed everything. Over time, I realized that understanding my story didn't mean excusing everything that happened. For a long time, I confused these two things. I thought that if I saw the causes, I would automatically be forgiving, but this is not the case. To understand is to look clearly, and clarity sometimes hurts more than ignorance. I started to revisit old memories with less haste to judge them. I observed my parents as people marked by their own limitations, raised within strict rules, with no room for dialogue. This did not cancel out what I experienced, but it explained part of the context. And that distinction was important to me. Understanding did not mean denying the impact. The control, the imposed silence, the absence of choices left real marks. Brands that have spanned decades, influenced decisions, and shaped who I have become. Acknowledging this was an act of honesty with myself. For years, I minimized my own pain because it didn't seem big enough. There were no scandals, no evident episodes, just a succession of small cancellations. Today, I understand that the lingering effect of this can be as profound as any single event. There were times when I felt angry again, anger that everything has been so normalized, because no one noticed, or because it was too convenient not to notice. This anger did not last long, but it was necessary. She showed me where the boundaries were that were never respected. I also had to deal with the sadness of accepting that certain conversations would never happen, that some questions would remain unanswered, that not everyone would be willing to listen to my version now. This acceptance was a silent but inevitable mourning. I realized that I spent much of my life trying to protect others from discomfort, while ignoring my own. Now, he was beginning to invert this logic, not out of selfishness, but out of balance. Taking care of myself didn't have to be a mistake anymore. This change in posture brought an unexpected lightness, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer carried guilt that did not belong to me. Responsibility for past choices began to separate from guilt for not having had a choice. I learned that some wounds don't heal completely. They just stop bleeding, and that's already a lot. I no longer seek to erase the past, nor to rewrite it. I try to live with him without him determining my every step. By accepting that my story had limits, I also accepted that I did the best I could with what I had. This realization did not come to accommodate me, but to pacify me. I survived as best I could, and that also has value. Today, when I think about what I experienced, I no longer feel the urgency to explain or justify. I just feel the need to be faithful to what I have learned. The truth doesn't have to be shouted to be real. Sometimes it is enough to be recognized internally. Understanding did not erase what happened, but it freed me from the obligation to carry everything myself. It allowed me to move forward without denying who I was. And above all, it gave me space to continue choosing, now with more awareness and less fear. At some point in this process, living ceased to feel like a constant effort. There was no announcement, nor a specific day to mark this change. I just realized that I woke up less tense, less vigilant, as if I no longer needed to defend myself from the world all the time. The silent struggle that had accompanied me for decades began to lose momentum, and that was as strange as it was liberating. For a long time, I confused resistance with strength. I thought that enduring everything in silence was a sign of character, that enduring discomfort was a virtue. Only now do I understand how much it cost me. Resisting all the time didn't make me strong. It just kept me in a permanent state of alertness, like someone who never really feels safe. The choices, once so heavy, began to emerge with less drama. There was still doubt. There was still fear, but they no longer decided for me. I could feel insecure and still move on. This simple possibility completely changed the way I moved in the world. I began to recognize my limits without shame. Fatigue is no longer an enemy to be overcome and has become a sign to be respected. I discovered that resting is not giving up on life, but allowing it to continue in a more honest way. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about quitting. My routine has not been visibly transformed. I still live in the same place. I still walk the same streets. I still wake up at similar times. What has changed is the way I spend my time. I no longer live trying to fill voids to appear useful. I've learned to be present, even when I'm not doing anything. The people around me reacted in different ways. Some have adapted naturally. Others kept their distance. Before, it would have destroyed me inside. Now I can understand that not all withdrawal is rejection. Sometimes it's just the other's difficulty in dealing with someone who has changed. I started to listen more to my own internal signals, something I never learned to do. When something bothers me, I pay attention. When something brings me peace, I allow it. This listening, which once seemed selfish, turned out to be a basic form of emotional survival that had always been denied to me. The past still appears, but it no longer drags me with it. I can remember without getting lost, look back without falling. This was one of the greatest achievements of this process. For years, I thought that revisiting my story meant reliving the pain. Today, it just means recognizing it. I began to notice small joys that had previously gone unnoticed. A coffee taken without haste, a silent day without obligation, a no said with tranquility. They are not grandiose moments, but they carry something new. They belong to me, not to anyone's expectations. Sometimes I still find myself thinking about who I might have been if I had awakened earlier. That question still hurts. But now it doesn't paralyze me. I learn to let it pass without punishing myself. Instead, I ask another, more honest and more possible question. Who can I be now? I started to treat myself with more kindness, something I was never taught. I have always been myself, demanding, little tolerant of my limits. Today, I understand that this rigidity was not discipline. It was fear of making mistakes, fear of disappointing, fear of existing outside the role I was given. Living is no longer a sequence of obligations disguised as moral duty. It became a set of imperfect but conscious choices. Not all of them bring immediate joy. Some bring discomfort. Still, they are mine, and that makes all the difference. I no longer feel the need to over-explain my decisions, nor to convince anyone. I learned that those who need to understand over time, and those who don't understand may never really be listening. This acceptance brought a peace that I had never experienced before. Today, I no longer see myself as someone who woke up too late. I see myself as someone who woke up when it was possible, when the silence became too loud to ignore, when guilt began to lose authority. Living stopped being resistance when I stopped fighting against who I am, and that for me is already a huge victory. Over time, I began to realize that my change didn't end with me. Even without great conversations, without announcements or long explanations, something different spread around. People felt it, even if they didn't know how to name it. My way of being in the world had changed, and this altered the way others related to me. I began to observe my own history more carefully, no longer as a sequence of mistakes or losses, but as a path marked by silences learned and choices postponed. That didn't make everything acceptable, but it did make everything understandable. And understanding brought a calmness that I had never experienced before. I looked at my children with new eyes, not as someone who needed to teach or correct, but as someone who needed to recognize. Recognize that I have often repeated patterns without realizing it, that the silence that shaped me also passed through me for them. This realization hurt more than any external confrontation. There were late conversations, yes. Not all. Not as complete as perhaps they should be, but real. At times, I was able to say simple things that had never been said. Things that did not change the past, but changed the climate of the present. And that was already more than I thought I would have. There were also silences that remained. Subjects that no one wanted to touch. Truths that were suspended, without form. I learned to accept that. Not every story needs a perfect closure. Some just need enough honesty not to keep hurting in the same way. I started thinking about what I leave behind, not in objects nor in material inheritances. I thought of the silent example, in the discreet gesture of someone who, even late, decided to live with more truth. Maybe it will reach someone, maybe not. But knowing that it exists is enough for me. I realize that old age doesn't have to be just repetition. It can also be correction. Not a correction of the past, but of the way we relate to it. For the first time, I felt that I wasn't just getting older. I was integrating everything I experienced. Time has come to be measured in a different way. No longer in quantity, but in presence. A day lived with conscience became worth more than years lived on automatic. This change completely altered my relationship with the idea of the end. I no longer think about death with the same fear as before. Not because I desire it or accept it completely, but because I have stopped feeling that I have not lived. I lived the way I could, and now I live the way I choose. This difference changes everything. Regret still appears sometimes. It does not disappear completely, but it no longer paralyzes me. I recognize him, listen to what he wants to tell me, and move on. It is no longer punishment and has become a late learning experience. I started to value the simple with another depth. An honest meeting, an unhurried conversation, a chosen silence. Small things but loaded with meaning. Not because time is short, but because it is now real. I understood that change does not erase the past, but transforms the way it echoes in the present. What once sounded like condemnation now sounds like history. An imperfect story, marked by the absence of choices, but also by survival. Today, I feel that I leave something different in the world than what I received. Not something grandiose, not something visible, but something true. The awareness that it is never too late to stop living on automatic. And at this point in life, that's all. There are conversations that we rehearse for decades and never have. They are stored in some quiet place in the mind, reappearing at unexpected moments, always unfinished. For a long time, I thought that these conversations did not happen for lack of opportunity. Today, I understand that it was not that. There was a lack of permission. There was a lack of space. There was a lack of security. I spent years wondering what I would have said to my father if I had had the courage. They were not accusations nor shouts. They were simple, almost banal sentences. That I was afraid, that I felt small, that I tried too hard to be accepted. These words never left my mouth, but they never ceased to exist within me. At the time, I believed that silence was respect, that to speak would be treason, ingratitude, disobedience. Today, I understand that that silence was a form of protection. Speaking would have too high an emotional cost for someone who still depended on the approval of others to exist. Recognizing this changed the way I look at that young man I was. I also thought many times about what I wish I had heard. A simple, "What do you want?" A, "You don't have to be like this." A, "You can choose." These phrases never came, and accepting this absence was one of the most difficult griefs I faced. Because it is not a matter of losing something you had, but of never having received something essential. For a long time, I carried the feeling that something was pending, as if my story had been interrupted in the middle of a sentence. I waited in silence for someone to recognize this, that someone would say, even late, that I was right to feel what I felt. This recognition never came. Accepting that he would never come was painful, but also liberating, because it took me out of the position of someone who expects something from the other to move forward. I realized that continuing to wait was a way to stay stuck, and I had already spent too much time stuck in what didn't happen. It was then that I started to have these conversations internally, carefully, no judgment. I told myself what I had never heard. He recognized the pain that was ignored. It named control, imposed silence, lack of choice, not to feed resentment, but to give shape to what has always existed. These silent conversations rearranged my memories. The past is no longer a confusing block of contradictory feelings and has become clearer. There was care, yes. There was intention, perhaps. But there was also control, demand, and silencing. The two things coexisted. And recognizing this was an act of maturity. I learned that we don't have to choose between loving and recognizing limits. I can understand the limitations of those who came before and still admit the impact it had on me. One thing does not cancel out the other. This understanding took me out of extremes and put me in a truer place. I spent a good part of my life waiting for a symbolic reparation, something that would balance what was lost. Today, I understand that this reparation would not come from outside. It needed to be born in me, and it was born when I stopped minimizing my own experience. Today, when I think about those conversations that never happened, I no longer feel the same pinch. I feel respect for what I have endured. So I kept silent to survive. It was not heroism. It was adaptation. And recognizing this allowed me, finally, to rest. Conversations that never happened are no longer open wounds. They became an integrated part of my story. Not resolved, not perfect, but recognized. And integrating, I discovered late, is one of the most profound forms of healing that exist. For a long time, I used the word late as an accusation against myself. Too late to change, too late to choose, too late to live differently. That word carried weight, judgment, and defeat. Today, I look at it with different eyes. Perhaps it was not too late. Maybe it was just my time. I understood that each phase of life has its possibilities and its limits. In my youth, I had no internal space to choose from. There was a lack of awareness, a lack of security, a lack of permission. To demand courage from someone who was still trying to survive is not fair. This understanding brought a new gentleness to my past. I began to realize how hard I was on myself. I blamed myself for not having reacted, for not having left, for not having faced it. I ignored the context, the pressures, the silent learning that shaped me from an early age. Today, I can see that young man with more compassion than demand. I don't romanticize what I experienced. There were real losses. There were paths that can never be trodden again. It hurts, and it will always hurt a little. But the pain changes when it stops being an accusation and becomes mourning. An honest mourning which recognizes what was not without destroying what still is. Accepting that this is my time does not mean conformism. It means presence. It means to stop fighting with the timeline and start inhabiting the now with more wholeness. I discovered that living in the present does not erase the past, but it prevents it from continuing to decide everything. I started to look at my age with less shame. Aging is no longer synonymous with backwardness and has become a sign of a journey. Each year lived carries lessons that would not have been possible before, including this, that of choosing, even if on a smaller scale. Today, my choices are not grandiose. They do not involve dramatic ruptures or spectacular new beginnings. They are simple, everyday, silent choices. And maybe that's why they are so profound. They don't seek to prove anything. Just line up. I learned that living well is not about compensating for what has passed, but respecting what exists now. I don't try to make up for lost time. I try not to waste the time I still have living in disagreement with myself. This change in focus brought a tranquility that I never knew. There are still difficult days. Days when the past weighs more, when the feeling of backwardness returns. But now I know what to do with it. I don't run away. I don't judge myself. I just acknowledge and follow. Conscience does not eliminate pain, but it prevents it from becoming a prison. I understood that I didn't need a big final act to validate my story. It was enough to live with more truth from now on. It was enough not to repeat with myself the same silent violence that I learned so early. This in itself was already a rupture. Today, when I think of the word afternoon, it no longer hurts me in the same way. It just describes the moment I woke up. And waking up at any stage of life is still waking up. It's still a chance. It's still life. It wasn't too late. It was my time. The time when I could finally look at myself without fear, without guilt, without need for approval. And living, even if with slow steps, has become something that belongs to me. If I could talk to someone younger now, I wouldn't give long advice. I wouldn't say what to do or what to avoid. I would just say to pay attention to your own silences. They say a lot. They say where we shrink, where we learn to disappear, where we begin to believe that we have no choice. I spent most of my life thinking that to live was to fulfill. Fulfilling expectations, schedules, roles, promises, made without me having participated in them. I thought that was maturity. Today, I know it was just adaptation. An adaptation so profound that I almost forgot who I was before it. I don't tell this story to accuse anyone, nor to completely absolve myself. I tell you because it is the truth that I managed to reach. And because I know that many people experience something similar without knowing how to name it. Prolonged silence does this to us. It confuses. It took me a while to understand that what they called care also controlled me, that what they called normal also held me, that what they called love also silenced me. Understanding this did not destroy my story. It only made her more honest. There were losses that cannot be recovered, paths that will never exist again. This is real, and I don't pretend it doesn't hurt. But it is also real that continuing to live on automatic would be an even greater loss, a daily, invisible, constant loss. Today, my choices are simple, too small to attract attention, but each one carries something I've never had before: consciousness. I know why I choose. I know when I choose. And for the first time, I know I can choose. I didn't become someone else. I didn't become someone extraordinary. I just stopped abandoning myself. I stopped putting myself up again and again. I stopped treating my will as something dangerous or wrong. That changed everything inside. If you've come this far listening to this story, maybe something has touched you. Perhaps you also learned too early to be quiet. Perhaps he also believed that he had no option. If so, no, it doesn't define you forever. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told, not because they are weak, but because they need time to find space. When they find it, they change everything. Even if they don't change the world, they change those who live inside it. I don't know how much time I have left. Nobody knows. But I know how I want to live the time that is left. Not trying to make up for the past. Not running after what wasn't. Just living in alignment with who I am now. For years, I thought it was too late. Today, I know that late is not when time passes. Late is when we give up on ourselves. And I didn't give up. Even though it took a while, I stayed. If there's one thing I want to put on the record, it's this. You may have been controlled, silenced, forced to adapt. But as long as he is alive, there is still choice. Some truths come late, but even late, they still matter. If this story touched something in you, share this video. Not because it is mine alone, but because it speaks of patterns of silence and control that still shape many lives without being questioned. Maybe there's someone in your network who needs to hear that today. And sharing can be the first step to breaking a cycle that should never have been normal. I'll stay here reading every comment, really. Tell me what city or country you're watching from and what about this story has stayed with you. Your words matter more to me than you think.